Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the T&E Committee. I want to thank Mr. Levchenko for another great packet and DEP for your great work. Today, we're going to review and vote on the county's MPDES MS4 permit, 2018 Financial Assurance Plan, and 10-year solid waste plan. These are important items that the county has to submit to the state. I will highlight that the FAP permit on the agenda today is not regarding watershed restoration work performed in the county. It's simply an application process the state has established to ensure county's efforts meet the guidelines set by the Maryland Department of the Environment. On the 10-year solid waste plan, the committee won't take final action today. We'll take this opportunity to dive deep into the draft plan. Just last week, we received a large report on this issue. I want to ensure that the committee has the opportunity to review all the documents and hear from all sides on the issue. It's my hope that we can schedule a final vote relatively soon. And moving on, as we continue to address the pressing COVID-19 pandemic, we can't forget about the great sense of urgency and responsibility we have to ensure we're on track to responding to climate change and its impact. These two agenda items help us to establish goals to guide us in our efforts to do just that. So I want to open it up to my colleagues for any opening remarks, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Levchenko. Anything, colleagues?
There's going to be a lot of discussion and a lot to unpack, so I'll save my comments for the actual conversation.
Exactly. Okay, Mr. Levchenko.
Okay, the first item on the agenda is the financial assurance plan. The Maryland Department of the Environment requires each what's called a Phase 1 MS4 jurisdiction, like Montgomery County, to file these financial assurance plans every 2 years. The last one was filed in February 2019, so 2 years later, here we are. I've noted in the packet, the second page of the packet, what the financial assurance plan, or FAP, must demonstrate. Primarily, the FAP is intended to show whether a jurisdiction is on target to meet its MS4 permit requirements, and in particular, its impervious surface restoration requirements that are a major driver of capital costs in the permit. The FAP in itself does not affect the permit requirements themselves, but is simply reporting on the status of work, both operating and capital, that's occurring under the permit. And I will note that in this particular FAP, we have both planned and completed actions presented as our projected expenditures and the source of funds, and whether that funding would meet the required expenditures to do that planned work. DEP completed the FAP based on its approved and planned work assumed in the FY21 operating budget and the FY21 through 26 CIP. This year's FAP is a little complicated by the fact that we're between permits. We've been that way for a few years now. The 2010-2015 permit is still technically in effect since we don't have a new permit we're operating under yet. However, the county met its restoration requirement under that permit in December 2018. At MDE's request, DEP did revise its FAP that was initially sent to the council, reflecting that we have a lot of additional work that's assumed to happen. So the revised permit does show planned costs going forward, effectively showing how we would meet the next permit, or the draft permit, if you will. So it is an important point. We have ongoing restoration work, for instance, which will be credited to the upcoming permit, and that work is both happening now, but also planned and reflected in this FAP. The next permit itself is still, as I mentioned, in a draft status. The public comment period ended in January. We are expecting the permit to be finalized later this year. I guess it depends somewhat on how significant any changes they make from the draft permit are, but it could be as early as this summer if there's fewer changes, perhaps. We did receive a briefing last October on the status of this next permit and the conditions assumed in that permit, so we weren't planning to delve into that set of issues today. However, DEP is available to provide an update or answer any questions you have on the draft permit and any pieces of that and how they're reflected in the FAP. But in general, I think basically this FAP indicates that we have sufficient funds planned to meet the requirements of the upcoming permit. It's in Montgomery County, we do have a dedicated fund. The water quality protection charge is the primary source of revenue for that fund, and the water quality protection fund is where we provide most of the revenue to support the permit work. So unlike other jurisdictions which may not have a dedicated fund, we do, and that puts us in good stead with regard to the financial assurance plan, certainly, and a lot of our planning work. So that's a key point. Exactly how we will meet the upcoming permit is not fully defined yet. DEP is working on a request for procurement for a contract that would allow for the hiring of a managing contractor who would be responsible for overseeing the selection, design, permitting, and construction of projects to meet the new permits restoration goal. And once again, DEP can provide more information on that today if you'd like. But that I did want to distinguish that from the contracting process that had been discussed several years ago with much debate at the council. This is a significantly different contract from that. And DEP has been providing some information to council members upon request on that. But if the committee as a whole would like further information, we can also talk about that. But with that, unless the committee members have specific questions about the FAP, staff is comfortable recommending approval of the FAP as revised by DEP and as included in the council staff report today.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Welcome, Director Ortiz, Mr. Dawson, Ms. Bubar, Ms. Stevens. Good to see you all again. Are we on track to getting our permit approved?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, and happy Monday to members of the committee. Mr. Chairman, things are looking good. We were able to meet the past permit requirements. This is, as I mentioned before, an emerging industry. Jurisdictions are required to do a lot of work in a short period of time. In the stormwater industry, it's very young. And it's expensive, as we know. So the county's out in front. It has always been out in front. And not only did we complete our last phase, we got a jump start on the next phase as well. As you may recall, the previous council and county executive sort of struck a deal after lots of intense discussions that thankfully I was not a part of. Where there was a series of projects that were set aside as priority projects to be done by a contractor. Well, long story short, in between the finalization of our current permit, we got to work on many of those projects. So work is still getting done, and we feel very confident about this next phase. But I'm happy to take any questions from you, Mr. Chairman, or other members of the committee.
Do you expect any challenges or changes in getting the permit approved?
We do not. The regulatory process is a little bit of a black box. So, I have to, admit I can't see into the crystal ball. But we've had a lot of discussion with the state. Our staff is very intensely involved. And we've just had a lot of communication. So we think that we've addressed, any outstanding questions or concerns and have a sense of what the state's priorities are. So at this time, we don't anticipate anything, but time will tell.
What concerns did the state raise?
Well, I'm going to defer to Frank Dawson and Amy Stevens, who've been closer to the process, now that we get the weeds a little bit.
So thank you, Adam. I'll start. So our understanding is that the permit's going to be issued in June with an effective date in August. I'm not sure there were really all that many major issues in our discussions with MDE. They did increase our restoration requirement over what we felt was the maximum extent practicable, but it was something we felt we could accomplish within our budget. We certainly had concerns and wanted to have a force majeure component to the permit, not fully understanding the impact of COVID on our budget. Amy, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that.
No, we work very closely with MDE, and we addressed most of their comments. They did make some changes sort of towards the end based on what the Environmental Protection Agency wanted from Region 3. So there are some there are differences in this permit than there have been in previous ones, but we feel very good about the permit, and
What are the
we're awaiting it.
differences since the new administration took over?
No, since our 2010 permit was issued.
Right. Okay. What are the differences?
They put some metrics in that we haven't had in the past, specifically for a number of outreach events, which was new outreach efforts we have to achieve, requirements for PCB source tracking, which was not in our previous permit, doing updates to our TMDL implementation plans. For the restoration requirement, there are now benchmarks in the permit that we have to achieve. There's a salt management plan.
Right.
That's a requirement. There's a good housekeeping plans that are requirements. And that's the extent of the changes.
I was anticipating the salinity monitoring, but what's a good housekeeping plan?
That's for other pollutants not regulated by stormwater pollution prevention plans. All of our depots have stormwater pollution prevention plans. So now we're looking at landscaping practices. Salt is another aspect. Any other pollutant that otherwise is not, any other property that is otherwise not regulated under a stormwater pollution prevention plan.
Okay. Colleagues, any questions?
No, I'm good. You asked the relevant one, so thank you.
Okay, Mr. Levchenko, anything else we can do on this topic?
No, if the committee is supportive, we'll just forward it to the council for approval, and then they can submit it to the state as a final approved document.
Okay, I think without objection. Mr. Reamer, that fine with you? Unanimous?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, on to the 10-year solid waste plan, I believe, Mr. Levchenko.
Yeah, that's our next item.
Yep.
I'll provide some background, and then we do have we do have some slides from DEP to walk us through some of the issues that I've identified in the packet that'll help, I think, sort of help us get through the item in an orderly manner and get us to the point where we can get to the questions we want to ask. As Chair Hucker mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, the interest today is really laying out the issues and identifying where we may need to come back and have the committee do maybe a final approval at a second meeting. But we'll see where we are at the end of this. Just as some quick background before we get into the slides, the executive transmitted this comprehensive update back in early February. The update is intended to be done every 3 years. We're a little bit late this time around, and there's several good reasons for that. First, the county was developing a food waste strategic plan, and it was well understood that that would have significant implications for the 10-year solid waste plan. And then also, we had an aiming for zero waste planning process that similarly was expected to have a major bearing on the 10-year plan. And the strategic plan the food waste plan came out in 2018. The aiming for zero waste planning process concluded last year around April. And then you can probably guess where I'm going next is we had the pandemic, which has slowed us down a bit as well. So we're now 5 years into this plan. And that explains why we're here today, which is really to try to get this off the decks and get it to the state late, but in good shape. So that's the goal today. And before we get into the slides, I did also want to note that it's about a 200-page plan, but a lot of the plan has to do with background and demographic information, information about legislation, regulations, how the solid waste management system works, existing facilities, things like that, that I don't think the committee needs to focus a lot of time on. I think what the committee wants to focus on is really Chapter 5, which is the Plan of Action section of the plan update. And it is important to note at the outset that much of the plan update does focus on broad policy issues and notes a lot of further study that is needed, and less so on prescriptive actions and deadlines. And that's not always the case. In past years, we have had prescriptive items in the 10-year plan, and that's required the executive branch to move forward with actions in a certain manner and get back to the council. This plan has a lot more in terms of additional work that's needed to be done to get us to those points. And that's expected because we have had, for instance, the food waste plan a couple years ago that informs this plan and leads to a lot of other issues. And similarly with the Aiming for Zero Waste Task Force, we've had a lot of follow-up on that that's needed. So just wanted to couch that. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to DEP to walk through the slides. And then from there, we can dig deeper into the issues that the committee wants to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen right now and bring the slides up. Can everyone see the slide on the screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so Adam, if you want to walk through, or whoever in DEP, and I'll flip the slides when you let me know.
Okay, great, Keith. Yeah, I'll take the wheel, but staff, as always, is invited to jump in during or after if there's anything that should be added. So next slide. So as Keith said, there's a lot of background information, but really we're going to focus on Chapter 5. We can go to the next slide in the interest of time. This is a state mandate, but flows also from a number of federal requirements. And essentially, this is to ensure that jurisdictions have a reliable disposal plan for waste. Solid waste is one of the very first environmental policy areas, going back to the Roman Empire and before. So this is a pretty big deal. We have to describe that we have the capacity, have the planning, have the infrastructure to take care of our waste in an environmentally responsible way. You go to the next slide, Keith. So as he mentioned, really the good stuff is in Chapter 5. In the interest of time, we don't need to go through the background data. That's just descriptive to give our regulator a sense of what the solid waste needs are in the county and what infrastructure we have. But we can keep going. Again, some details here. We can pass through this. It's in your packet if you want more information. All right, so the good stuff. In Chapter 5, we focus on infrastructure. It's the county's responsibility to make sure that we can move solid waste, recycling and composting in a responsible and fluid way, in an environmentally responsible manner. So there's a lot of emphasis on our facilities. Of course, Montgomery County, we go above and beyond in what we currently do and what we plan to do in the future, and I'll go in a little more detail. But the infrastructure is a big deal. Montgomery County is very, very blessed to have control of virtually the entire system. We own our own recycling facility. We have a compost facility in Dickerson. We have the incinerator, although it's clearly a controversial issue. It's part of the county's system. So we're not, regardless of where we go, the transfer station, everything is in our control. And that's really the best position to be in. In addition to the infrastructure, we got to, be smart about how we manage stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the programs. Several of them are underway in operations, and then finally get into detail about policies and legislation, because that really changes behavior and begins to alter society, and of course has big implications. But we'll go into more detail. Keith, you can go to the next one. So regarding the recycling facility, and I think everybody has been to the facility who's on this call. And one of my first meetings with Evan Glass was at the facility. It's a great facility. It was designed and put into place around 1990, but it's out of date. And we've covered this a lot in the past. I won't go into too much detail, but we have a preliminary design from a contractor for a full modernization of the facility on its present footprint. Some of the innovations that we're going to be installing are robotic sorters, and it's just like it sounds, robotic arms that can identify the materials and sort it with more precision. And also reduce labor costs, optical sorters, which also recognize and are able to blow or use other technologies to sort the material as well. And also segregating glass at the very beginning of the process. As glass breaks, it gets into some of the other materials and then degrades the value for them. And also glass being sorted at the end of the system goes through multiple conveyors. So then it also gets broken and mixed, reducing its value, but we can go into more detail. Keith, you can go to the next slide. I think this might be a video. I don't know if you can click on it, Keith.
There we are.
All right, cool. So there are several firms that have robotic technologies it's programmable, so it can identify certain types of plastic, it can identify color, it can sort. We're learning about this internally, but there's a lot of promise for having better sorting, less contamination, and more reliability. You can go to the next slide, Keith. Food scraps, as Keith mentioned, a lot of tremendous work has been done by staff, stakeholders, and community members on having a strategic plan for how we're dealing with food scraps in the larger food system. What we know is that food is an organic that has value, just like an aluminum can does, or a piece of cardboard. It should also be recycled. And when food is mixed with carbon waste, so leaves and garden trimmings, that folks put out on their curb under our current system, it has the potential for creating a higher grade compost. Montgomery County and Prince George's produce a soil amendment known as leaf grow. It's a very well known and well respected product that's on the shelves of big box stores as well as small hardware stores and landscapers. But by getting food scraps into our system, we can create a product that's known as leaf grow gold. Prince George's produces it now. We don't produce it here in Montgomery County yet, but we have a very strong interest in doing so. There's a lot to this subject, and I'll save a lot of it for the questions. But some of the bigger decisions on policies, like requiring restaurants or commercial entities to compost, really must depend on the ability for that food scrap material to be processed locally. So we're looking at various options to figure out how the county can better control its own destiny on food scraps. So the first option is to utilize the existing compost facility in Dickerson. As you know, it's used for carbon, so leaves and yard trim that's put out at the curb. But there's a covenant with the Sugarloaf Citizens Association that prevents us from bringing food scraps there. So that is an option, but would require some negotiation and a new agreement. The second option is a new compost facility at another site in the county. The third option is that we work with a third-party operator in some kind of public-private partnership, and that the county has received some soft approaches from anaerobic digester companies and others for such a setup, and I can talk more about that if there's interest in that. And the fourth option is the status quo, which is sending our food scraps to the Prince George's County facility. And although that's a fantastic blue ribbon facility, it is very far away in Upper Marlboro. So it's a long trek. In addition to the carbon footprint, it makes it tough for compost hauling companies to efficiently do trips from Montgomery County to Prince George's, especially as the scope and scale of food scrap collections grow. You can go to the next slide, Keith. I'm going to try not to geek out too much on everybody here, but just heads up, because we'll be talking about this more in the future. There's essentially two processes that are used for composting. The first is anaerobic digestion, or the first that we'll talk about here, which is a contained facility that creates methane in an anaerobic environment. The methane can be converted to energy, and then it creates a product, a digestate, that has to be further processed, but then can also be turned into compost after some post-processing. It's rather capital intensive. It requires a lot of chemistry and engineering, and is relatively higher tech, but there are some benefits. The second one is aerobic composting. This is the system that Prince George's uses, and that picture at the bottom is from their facility. It's a lower tech system where the material is mixed and then covered. You see that cover. That cover in particular, what the Prince George's folks use, a cover product made from the Gore-Tex company. So those of you who are hikers or bikers or skiers are familiar with Gore-Tex jackets. Well, this membrane, this fabric, is exactly the same. So it keeps rain out, but allows the compost to breathe. So there's a controlled environment, and it accelerates the compost process exponentially, and provides more predictability and surety. So I'm going to stop myself there for your sake, but those are the two technologies that are also in the mix as we try to figure out the county's future. Next slide, Keith. This is the EPA's hierarchy. It informs, not just our system, but everybody's waste system, that we do want to always focus on source reduction and reuse. And as all of you know, I've been in front of this committee pushing new laws in that spirit, but it's all one system, so it all works together. So as we get a little bit deeper in the presentation, you'll see that in addition to the disposal methods, which are toward the bottom, energy recovery and treatment and disposal, there's a lot of other things that we need to do to lower the stress farther on, and we want to spend as much time and energy as possible on those top tiers. Go to the next slide, Keith. I'm really excited, and this is the first time this has been mentioned in public, but we're in the early stages of planning and redesigning the transfer station at Durwood into the Ecopark at Shady Grove. And although in many ways the current transfer station is an Ecopark, many of you have been there. You can drop off all sorts of materials, from electronics to appliances to books to clothing, and it gets reused. All of those uses are fantastic, and again, Montgomery County is very blessed and unique in having a facility like that. It's a little outdated, and the system has grown, and we do a lot of good things there, but there's a lot of congestion. There's not an easy flow of traffic. It's not always safe to drop off material just because there's not enough pedestrian access, and it's easy to get clogged up. So we want to do a redesign that incorporates more uses and provides more opportunities for diversion, as well as creating a better customer experience. So the idea, branded as an Ecopark, sends the message to the public that this is a place to be sustainable. You can take your unwanted materials that have some value and potential for reuse to be taken there to be reused, rather than the concept a transfer station, which is just about moving garbage around. So, a lot more we can talk about here, but this is in the early stages. This is a concept, and we'll be reaching out through procurement process to get a more sophisticated design for future discussion. But I'm really excited to share this concept with you this afternoon. Go to the next slide, Keith. So the aiming for zero waste process that Keith mentioned and participated in. Thanks, Keith, for your insight and support and participation in that work group. After we do all this other stuff, there's still stuff in the waste stream that we just can't do anything with. It's either a material that or mixture of materials or products that can't be easily separated or used again for various reasons, or it's something that has little or no value. So there is always going to be, even though we aspire for zero waste, at least in the next generation or several, there's certainly going to be non-recoverables, things that we just can't recycle or reuse. So what do we do with that stuff? The DEP is still in the process of due diligence, trying to figure out the pros and cons and ramifications of the different options, but essentially this is what they are. Disposal there's the current, the status quo, of course, is the incinerator at Dickerson. Options other than that are disposal at an out-of-state landfill. The second one, another option, is to build our own landfill on Site 2. And Site 2 is a county-owned property, I believe more than 200 acres, just south of our current facility in Dickerson. And then third, which would complement these options, is disposal technologies that might be able to recover more energy or more refined sorting before it gets to disposal. But nonetheless, there's still going to be material, at least for the foreseeable future in our world, of stuff that we just can't do anything with, that must be disposed of. There's basically three lenses that we're looking at the options. One is environmental justice. Very rightfully, equity is front and center here in the county and in our country, but especially in our county with the Racial Justice Act and everything that all of you have fought for over the years, as well as the county executive. So we want to make sure that we're not overburdening an existing community someplace else with the county's trash. The second one is environmental impacts. So looking holistically about the impact of one methodology versus another, including the transportation. And then finally, of course, the costs. So, regardless of what we decide, there's probably going to be some kind of cost implication. And that's, of course, when it will come to the county council through the county executive's budget. So those are all things that we're looking at. Very, very complicated issue. So we're in the weeds with that, but that's where we are on that at this time. Next slide, Keith. This is really the fun stuff. So, this is briefing the county executive on what came out of the Aiming for Zero Waste report. Lots and lots of ideas, and we can really talk for probably the rest of the year about all the ideas and the options. But we have done a preliminary sort, pun intended, of some of the different programs over the next few years for rolling out. So in our current fiscal year, we've already rolled out, again, pun intended, commercial food scraps recycling program. We captured our 200,000th pound of commercial food scraps even during COVID, so we're excited about that. We've been focusing on educating residents on recycling right at the curb. In the interest of time, we can come back to some of these, but you get the idea. Some of the, either want to pull out anything of particular interest. In the next fiscal year, moving into residential food scraps. So that first box under 2022, that's a big one, and we'll be issuing an RFP out shortly on that. Very excited for private sector participation in the collection. And then expanding that in 2023. Well, that's enough for now. I'm going to resist the temptation to do deeper dive down the rabbit hole. Go ahead, Keith. So commercial food scraps I mentioned, underway, successful program so far. We have a dozen folks, and we're close to announcing a really big partnership, not ready for prime time, but just to whet your appetite a little bit. Big player in the county who we expect to be participating in the commercial food scrap program. In addition to just picking up their stuff, we're doing education with them on the on how it all works, how to do it safely, and how it can help their bottom line, with the goal, and I know this has come up in the past, with the goal of moving these customers on to our private sector haulers. So we've been trying to target businesses and entities that could make a big difference, who have no plans to compost, to kind of onboard them, sort of a gateway experience, and then pass them off and onto the private sector. And a handful of our 12 partners will be cycling off in the next few months. So excited about that. Very successful so far. Go to the next slide, Keith. For residential, we get so much interest from the public in providing curbside pickup. There are some municipalities that already do provide curbside pickup, Chevy Chase, Tacoma, a handful of others, which is great. But it's important that the county do this as well. So we're really excited to be rolling out 2 single-family routes. One is in the greater Bethesda area, other in Silver Spring. As I mentioned, that RFP will be out shortly. So the first year will be a first phase, and then we'll be expanding in subsequent years. But our goal is to have 1,700 households participating with that potential. So stay tuned, more to come on that. Next slide, Keith. Again, more good, geeky, fun stuff here. So this is some of the bigger picture stuff. So if we really have any hope of approaching zero waste, we have to do things on various levels. We spent a lot of time in this presentation so far talking about infrastructure. Infrastructure is, the rock solid stuff that the county has to provide, and we're trying to up our game there, as you can see from the Ecopark concept to the modernized recycling facility and composting. It's behavioral, so we're at the curb in residential neighborhoods, educating residents who aren't recycling right, and we're seeing a lot of impact from that. But there's still a lot of stuff that we have to do to make sure that the industry is not overburdening us at the end of the day. At the end of the day, the government, us at DEP, and all of you in the different ways that you support us, we end up cleaning up after this disposable society. And we're happy to do it, but it'd be great if it wasn't as heavy a lift, and it would be great if it wasn't as costly a lift. And it is costly when there's just so much material out there, especially when a lot of it is not recyclable, when we have the burden of disposing on it. So internally, we're in the workshop, but you'll be hearing about a number of these policies coming out soon. One is extended producer responsibility of various products, that those that are hazardous or those that are not recyclable, that the manufacturers or the brands have some stake in helping us dispose of those materials, so the burden isn't entirely on the county. Looking more at single-use containers. We've talked about that previously. Shopping bags. I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through any one of these. I'm just going to pull out a couple things. Standardized labeling is a big deal. There's a lot of confusion in the recycling stream, if you recall from our conversation about number 6 plastics. So we are in conversation with the federal government to try to improve standards on that. Now that's important. Another one that gets talked about a lot is save as you throw. And this is trying to cost modulate for homes and businesses that recycle more and trash less. So providing some kind of monetary or other incentive. That's a difficult policy area on a large scale, but it's something we're committed to figuring out. Generally, it works on smaller scales, and where we have an interest in partnering with the municipality for piloting a save as you throw system. But I can talk more about that. Another one I want to flag is the issue of Subdistrict B. So that's generally the northern part of the county, where the county does not provide services. OLO provided a very in-depth report to all of you last year. Subdistrict B is important from a sustainability perspective and from a policy perspective. Currently, that's approximately half of the county that we don't have any partnership with as the government. I won't repeat all the issues, but it's hard to make a lot of progress on some of these issues, especially at the curb, and to ensure that we're getting the best materials possible when we don't have a direct relationship with collections and with residents in that part of the county. But in the interest of time, we can move on, but happy to do a deeper dive in this call or in other conversations. Keith? All right, and here we are. I am not Willie Wayner, wish I were, but I'm happy to take any questions in the meantime. And I'm also joined by members of our team. So thank you, everybody. If you're still awake, I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you all. That's terrific. Any questions for my colleagues?
Sure. So not quite sure where to begin here, right? To continue Director Ortiz's line of puns, there's a lot to sort out, right? So that's it for me, at least consciously. So first off, I'll say, so it was a big weekend for me because I visited the Ecopark. Little did I know of what's to become. And so I went and dropped off a bunch of large yard trimmings, and then also some electronics to the transfer station. And yeah, I mean, as you noted, Director Ortiz, you and I visited there, which seems like a while ago, but the navigation still needs to be sorted out, but it is what it is, kind of like a safari. So instead of Ecopark, Eco Safari, right? You got the electronics on your left and you got the plastics on your right. And then when I went home, I put together a compost bin. So a big eco weekend for me. And so taking a step back, again, I'm not really sure where to begin here, because not only was there your presentation and then Mr. Levchenko's very detailed report, but then over the last number of days, we received additional correspondence from environmental leaders here in the county, a very detailed report as well, put together on their own, thorough in its nature, just about what we need to be doing better here. And there are clearly some disconnects. And so that's part of the reason I'm not quite sure where to start here, trying to understand where DEP is, where central staff is, and then where the environmental community is. And I think we all share the same goal of continuing to move forward. And as has been stated numerous times, we are doing way more than is required of us by the state of Maryland, but we're in Montgomery County, so we don't rest on that, and we want to continue doing more, and we just have to. And so let me just start with some of the composting stuff, because it seems that is, as we all know and has been said, some of the easiest lift, quite frankly, because I'm just trying to look at my notes right here. Is it 170,000 tons of food scrap that is put into our waste system. And so if we can start, I caught myself, I was going to say if we can start peeling that back, but I said I wouldn't do that. So so if we start collecting that and diverting that, that will certainly mitigate other decision points with the incinerator. With, you know, I think you said there were 4 or 5 options out there, and clearly, you know, the ZTA that I had introduced earlier this year or late last year is in recognition of the steps that we have to take. And I'm speaking with folks in Annapolis at the state level about changing some of those state laws that restrict our composting ability on farms, recognizing that that is a very efficient way to deal with some of these this waste, the food waste. And so there's a lot of different directions to go in. But let me just ask about the residential composting, right? So clearly for the residential composting, there's the site in Dickerson, but then I presume that the Ecopark, and if we can start calling it that, I don't know if there, you know, if there's another term aside from just transfer station, but the revised transfer station would be able to accommodate more of that. Is that kind of the vision and the goal?
That's a good question. You know, one of the options was to find another site outside of the current composting facility. We're not sure, and again, this is why we want to engage procure a partner who can help us do a deeper dive into, you know, how much space is required for different uses. Can we accommodate the traffic flow? So it's conceptually an option, but it's as you know from being there, councilman, there's not a lot of elbow room, and depending on the technology, it might require a good amount of space. I would say, like at this point, you know, if I were a betting man, we would want a site with more room than that one, but that's still something we have to do further study on.
And just to do some level setting here, right? Because some of these conversations and decision points they have timelines associated with them. You know, renewals of contracts and other things. And because they're all interrelated, what is at this point your very basic timeline for revamping that site, the transfer station?
Well, there's no, you know, we're driving. There's other than public pressure for doing more, there's no regulator that says, hey, you gotta create an Ecopark by a certain date. The incinerator contract, the one that we're in now, is up in 2026. So if we want to reduce diversion by that point in time, you know, we want to move fast. So we're trying to capture as much waste as possible. But other than that, I don't think that there's any timeline other than the ones that are self-imposed. But I want to invite Patty or anyone else on my team to chime in with any other thoughts in response to Councilman's question.
This is Patty. I would agree that we don't have a deadline other than something that we would like to self-impose upon ourselves, but we haven't done that because there's just, you know, a few steps that have to be gone through. If it's possible to be able to secure the additional space next to the transfer station, that provides just a host of opportunities that would allow us to address not only the safety and space issues, but the environmental initiatives that we want to put in place. So, you know, that's probably more of a critical path item than anything else, is really trying to see if we can make progress on that. But in the meantime, we're just, you know, continuing to do as much as we can on all fronts.
Well, you're correct, right, about the timelines, and Director Ortiz, the timeline I was specifically referring to was the renewal of the contract, or if that's the right way to phrase it, with the incinerator. And you know, governments and bureaucracies rarely have their own timelines. They're usually external pressures and other types of events that force change. And I think we are clearly at that inflection point and cutting across a few different narratives and a few different scenarios. Is it possible, in your estimation, to close the incinerator while having the transfer site be what it currently is?
Well, that's one of the things that we're trying to understand better by bringing on consultants. So if we have to move to a long haul rail, and that will require infrastructure changes. If we decide to truck the material out, and that's what the report that you mentioned earlier recommends, that that trucks take the material out. All of that requires some planning and some accommodation. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a traffic engineer, nor am I a waste engineer. But I think we know that it's a substantial lift. So we're as I mentioned in the earlier slide, we're looking at the options and the ramifications associated with them. But it's but there's a budget aspect, there's a space aspect, contractual aspects to get that material either on rail or on truck to another site. And one of the benefits that with the current system is that a train can make the trip in a day, going from the transfer station to Dickerson, and come back with a limited amount of rail cars. If we're going longer by rail, it's a longer trip, so we'll need more cars. Most likely, again, another rabbit hole, but it will require a lot of planning, and we don't quite have our heads around the full implications of those options. Likewise with trucks, questions about how many trucks would be required, where would they be queued, would it come out of the Shady Grove facility? So are there traffic implications on Rockville Pike or Shady Grove Road, or does it go to Dickerson and truck from there? So those are all questions that we're just wading into at this time. Patty, is there anything that you would add?
No, you covered it.
And
Sure.
Mr. Glass, I think the issue on the incinerator, I mean, you mentioned the 2026 date, which is the end of the contract extension, but the real issue for the county is at what point do you have to put in a lot of resources to upgrade or continue the operation of that facility, and comparing that to other options such as rail haul or long truck haul. But you would obviously want to make a decision or have a good sense of those issues before you would put a lot of resources into the incinerator again to extend its life another 20 years. I think that's a more important decision point than the contract extension date, because the county does have options for ending contracts. There's language in the 10-year plan regarding that. So I don't think we want to get too hung up on a particular date. The issue is, when do we have the information we need to make the best infrastructure decisions based on costs and environment and all the issues that Mr. Ortiz mentioned earlier. That's when we need to. That's what we need to get the council positioned at, to have that information so that it can make an educated decision going forward, whenever that is.
Yes, you're absolutely correct. And so while, again, I'll go back to the government bureaucracy perspective, that there's no timetables usually internally. We know there is a timetable. That not only is the timetable set by the contract extension, but there is an external timetable with climate change, right? And so we need to get this going. But Mr. Lubchenco, you're absolutely correct in that a lot of smart people have different opinions about this, and I know, and everybody is on the correct side. I don't doubt where all of our hearts and minds are, particularly you all here on this screen and those who are advocating to us. It's just trying to sort through that and figure out what is possible in the most expedient manner, quite frankly. I'll turn back to the committee chair. Let me just end on this one point, and I'll come back need be. But with regard to the expansion of the composting programs that you referenced, Director Ortiz. I again just want to state for the record that we have some very incredible local entrepreneurs, green entrepreneurs doing this work, and want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that in this process.
Thank you. Noted and appreciated.
Mr. Chair, Mr. President.
Thank you, Council Member. Very helpful. Can we go back to the materials recycling facility? The additional money in the CIP, can you elaborate a little bit more on how that will be spent? How much is personnel? How much is equipment? What the goals are?
Sure. I'll defer to Patty.
I might need Lonnie's help here on some of the details because it's a project. I mean, it's a CIP project, so we pay for design and construction. Mm-hmm. The personnel costs, associated with management of that are included in the operating budget. Uh-huh. So it's recommended as a 2-year project that we would start in the beginning of fiscal year 22 if you approved it, and we would start with kind of full court press on the design. We have some work, kind of already underway on the design, but we would get going on the design starting in FY22 if you approved it. And we would also begin the process to issue bonds to be able to get some capital investment for the project, with the intention that we would want that cash from those bonds to begin to be available to us in FY22 so we could purchase the equipment and begin the construction under the assumption that the design would be completed in FY22 also. But we wanted to be able to have the cash available to us to start the actual purchasing of the equipment and installing that in FY22. If the project would have to go into FY23 to be completed, but we were trying to structure it so that we didn't have a major hit on the ratepayers to where the first debt payment on the bonds wouldn't be till FY23. So we're going to, and we've worked with the Department of Finance that we think we can do that so that we can have the cash available to get the project going well underway in FY22. But financially, we're able to not have a major hit on the ratepayers in FY22. But Lonnie, is there anything else that you want to add on the details for that?
There we go. No, not really, other than where we are is predominantly on the equipment. The idea is to get upgraded processing equipment, much higher efficiencies within the same footprint, and that's where we're going to be able to process everything that we currently collect.
And to your question on the personnel, I mean, obviously, county personnel would be, majorly involved in overseeing the construction of this, but we intend to do it with the assistance of MES in terms of, hiring the contractor to do the construction.
Okay.
And I think it is important to note on this that, as they hinted at, that this would increase the throughput of the facility to avoid the current bypass that has to happen now, where a substantial amount of commingled materials are going to a York, Pennsylvania facility for recycling that we pay on a per ton basis. So this would enable us to manage the bypass that we can't manage now. And as mentioned in the plan, it also might allow for some additional flexibility to take on other potential customers, including municipalities. You heard at the public hearing from Mayor Newton that the city of Rockville is certainly interested in being able to utilize that facility, but there's no space right now. It's something that could be considered in the future if the numbers worked out right.
Thank you. On construction demolition debris, I'm glad you're looking at the tipping fees and increasing them. How do ours compare to other jurisdictions?
We're pretty cheap. Yeah.
How'd you arrive at 76 a ton and not
a higher? So the policy goal that we are striving for is to have that be recycled, to have the C&D be recycled. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, there's just not a lot of places to be able to allow it to happen. So we are anticipating.
You mean not a lot of market, or not a lot of
the market
facilities that can do it? Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
the market doesn't exist right now. We're hoping that the Clarksburg facility opens up soon. You know, it was open, it had a fire, might be coming up on 2 years now. So we anticipate that opening back up, and we've been in contact with them trying to get a feel for what their rate would be. Although it's not open yet, so we're not sure. So what we arrived at was, we think is going to be, you know, maybe a little bit more than what they have their rate expected to be, with the goal of encouraging people to take their C&D up there so that it can be recycled. But if that isn't the case, if something does happen and that facility doesn't open back up, the $76 was also arrived on based on what our real costs are for handling that C&D material, and being able, because basically it's going to a landfill right now if it can't, you know, be handled up at the RF. And so either way, we were trying to make that price that we're charging, that fee that we're charging, consistent with our costs for getting rid of it, but also trying to encourage it to be recycled if and when that facility opens back up.
And 76 accurately reflects all our costs?
Pretty much, yeah. And you take a look at what it costs to, you know, kind of separate it out and then, you know, ship it to a landfill in Pennsylvania, which is where it's going if it can't be handled up at the incinerator.
Is there any statutory limit that doesn't allow us to charge more and generate revenue from providing this service?
Well, it is a fee for service, and so we basically have to have some fidelity.
That's what I'm asking, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, basically your fees should cover the cost of services, but obviously, you know, there's lots of numbers that go into that calculation. But
is there a market for it anywhere?
Not that I'm aware of, where it's actually recycled.
Right. Are there other jurisdictions that you think do a better job on this topic?
I don't think so. Yeah, maybe others have better information.
Yeah, it's I have a little bit of familiarity with this, not a ton, but there are a handful of recyclers around the Mid-Atlantic region. There aren't a ton because man, the puns, Councilman Glass, but there's
You didn't want to point it out.
I know,
yeah.
It's just too easy at this issue area. But it requires a big footprint. It requires, you know, a lot of permitting. You know, it's dusty, it's dirty, it's loud. So it does exist. There's one in Prince George's County, southern Prince George's. There's a big one in New Jersey called Revolution Recycling. So it can work, but it requires, I think, some intentionality between the government sector with private industry. But we're excited with Clarksburg coming back online. We have a good relationship with them, and hopefully we can reinvigorate that here.
Okay. I think 12 years ago, I put in a study commission bill to have the state look into improving this operation. MDE summarily killed it. On pay as you throw, what has been the success in other jurisdictions?
I'll introduce this topic a little bit, and then I'll if anyone else wants to jump in.
You've done a good job.
Please do. Well, the places that do it, from what I'm told, are generally smaller places. The largest city that does it, largest jurisdiction, as far as I know, and again, I qualify this with this is something we're still studying, so I may just not be aware yet, is Worcester, Massachusetts. So they have a system, and there's different, and it can work different ways. There's sort of a spectrum. There's only a certain type of bag that you're allowed to use, and the bags are very expensive. So the collection contractor will come open, or the city or whatever, it will be looking and see if they have the right kind of bag, but it's a very expensive bag. Or there's a ticket system or a sticker system that people have only a certain amount of stickers or tickets to use a year, and then they have to buy more, and it goes in. And then there's other softer ones that just are that the trash cart is small and the recycling and composting carts are bigger. So it's incentivized it that way. But we're not aware yet of anybody who's doing it at a large scale well. But again, we're still doing homework on this.
But Worcester's a big place. But has it had the effect of of encouraging people to reduce their trash?
Well, from what we're told, and again, I admit we're still learning, is it works best when there's also a compost program available at the same time, because a lot of waste and a lot of weight is in food products. Vegetables carry a lot of water, etc. So those are when it's most effective. But yeah, from what we've gathered so far, when those programs exist in tandem, there is a reduction.
And in your old role, even though Prince George's has a food compost program, they haven't looked into this, or have they decided not to go in this direction?
Yeah, at the time, the county did a softer version with a smaller bin. I wanted a very, very small bin. Instead, I had to compromise with a smaller bin, but maybe things will be different here in Montgomery County. But no, Prince George's has not pursued a more aggressive program than that.
Would people just be able to order another bin, or do you have to use the bin you're given and you can't get a second one?
Yeah, again, there's different programs. You could be charged for putting more out, or you would just have to wait.
I thought that was the whole point. Okay.
Yeah, and just another factor is that the collection companies in general are very opposed to this, because they feel like they have to get through their routes quickly, get the material, get to the transfer station, and then get back out. So so there would be a contractual element, small detail, but not a small detail, because there might be a staffing component that we have to have staff doing random. But conversation for another time.
Okay. Any other questions, colleagues? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm
hand raised. No worries. I was looking for a
right.
chat.
Thank you. Just two quick issues. Keith, can you talk about, there's reference in there to essentially the climate impact of the incinerator and closing it if material is then trucked out. And I see in the packet, it seems to say that would essentially be an increase of our emissions. Can you just expand on that, please?
Sure. Yeah. Last year, as part of the Aiming for Zero Waste planning process, DEP had the benefit of a consultant look at a number of solid waste related issues. And near the end of the process, they were looking at the what's left issue that you heard earlier, and looked at looked at the alternative of continued incineration of waste versus the trucking or the rail haul. One of the issues they looked at was what are the greenhouse gas implications of that? And they used what's called the EPA WARM model, WARM, in measuring the greenhouse gas emissions from the RRF and also from landfills. And I included I think I included the footnote in the packet about that. Obviously, how you count matters a lot. And in the WARM model, the focus is on what they call human-generated greenhouse gas emissions. And based on that definition and how they calculate it, biogenic emissions, which food waste would fall into, are not counted as part of that. They're seen as the regular carbon cycle that would happen regardless of the human interaction here, if you will. And that basically the incinerator is accelerating the emissions, but it's not creating new emissions. Conversely, with landfilling of biogenic waste, you generate a lot of methane. And that methane would not normally happen except through the landfilling. So it's considered human-generated greenhouse gas emissions. So in the model the consultant used, it uses that the assumptions that I just mentioned. Landfilling does not look good because methane is a much higher contributor to greenhouse gas emissions per ton than CO2 is. So the landfilling looks bad and the incineration tends to look better. But the WARM model is obviously not the only model people would use to look at this. And a good example is the report that was submitted last week from the environmental groups that focus on a different way of approaching the greenhouse gas inventory, if you will. And from their perspective, they see greenhouse gas emissions being substantially worse at an incinerator versus a well-managed landfill. So I think that issue really needs to be further reviewed. We'd like DEP to look at that and go through the Environmental Advocates report on that issue and a number of other issues, and give us their best analysis, whether it's theirs or whether they can find a third-party consultant to weigh in, to educate us on the different ways to look at emissions through these different disposal methods.
Okay, well, that seems like an important issue for us to, really work our way through. And, I don't think we would want to sign off on a plan that we know is going to actually make the whole problem worse with climate change.
Yeah, I mean, if you look in the climate change report, if the pie chart that shows where the emissions are inventoried, it's buildings and transportation, which is the vast majority. The solid waste wedge is very small, but that's because they're using that warm model methodology within that. Once again, it depends on how you count.
So they use the model in the climate plan.
Well, the climate plan its inventory is based on regional calculations managed by the Council of Governments. So it's not that the county made up how to count the numbers. We're consistent with how it's being done in the region.
Okay. At one point, the executive had made sort of a different point, which I tended to agree with, or I agreed with, that there's sort of an underlying ethical issue about communities exporting waste. How is that reflected in this report?
Well, I think you mean in the Environmental Advocates report, or the 10-year plan?
In the 10-year plan.
Oh, well, the 10-year plan it references the executive's goal of closing the incinerator, but it also references that there's a lot of further study and work that needs to be done to get there, as Mr. Ortiz mentioned. It doesn't delve into all those issues and what they are and what has been determined, if you will. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. That's recognized in the plan that came over from the executive. So we don't have that issue of the environmental justice issue that Mr. Ortiz mentioned. That's not defined per se in the 10-year plan that came over.
Okay. All right. Well, it seems like something we have to get our heads around here. And what is your recommendation there?
Well, my suggestion is that, and a lot of this plan has it references all this additional work that needs to be done. My concern is that we get on a path where this work gets done and the council's in a position to weigh in on the issue. I don't feel the council is really in a position to weigh in on the future of the incinerator today. I think that's where this additional work has to be done so that we can be educated on all these issues. And certainly the sooner that can happen, the sooner the council can have a discussion of this issue and all the implications, the cost issues, environmental issues, including the greenhouse gas emissions, operational issues. We just don't have our hands around that yet. Now, the plan as submitted doesn't say that the incinerator will be closed. It just says that it's a goal of the executive. So my only interest was that the council is not necessarily buying into that goal right now. I think the council is interested in getting educated on it.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Anything else we should cover today, Mr. Lubchenco?
I did want to close the loop on the Subdistrict B issue.
Yeah.
It was referenced earlier.
I just want to warn you, I got to stop at 4, but that's fine.
Sure.
We probably won't solve that whole problem today either.
No, my only suggestion there is that we have the benefit of the Office of Legislative Oversight report. I think the council needs to do what it does with these reports, which is go through the process of reviewing that report, hearing from interested parties, going through that issue. And I think that's going to happen through the council processes and doesn't have to wait for the 10-year plan to weigh in on that. I think we need to do our work on that since we have a report before us. I think the other issues, we talked about pay-as-you-throw, C&D. They have a lot of recommendations in the plan that I think all parties, staff, environmental advocates, other council members not even here, I'm sure would all agree with. And so I think they're fine being in the plan. I think there's just a lot of work that has to be done to get to the point where those recommendations can happen. So, as I mentioned in the report, a lot of this has to come back in some form to the council anyway. You're going to see some of these issues in the budget this year.
Right.
The materials recovery facility amendment, it's already come over on March 15th.
Yes.
Additional food waste initiatives in FY22. So all of it's moving forward. It is a lot. I mean, all these pieces tend to fit together at some point too. You heard about food composting, and if we can dramatically reduce or divert food waste, well, then maybe we can also talk about reduced trash collection frequency. That's another recommendation that was in the Aiming for Zero Waste Task Force report. Pay as you throw, those all sort of link together.
Yes.
Or have to be considered together at least in Subdistrict B. So those are all big issues that can have a significant impact in the next, in the near future. And I think DEP is committed to doing that. And I think this 10-year plan includes the appropriate language to assume that is going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Right. All good points. There's a lot more we're going to have to take up, and some of the most urgent of which we'll take up in the budget. Councilmember Glass.
Yeah, so just real quick, picking up on that OLO report, which I remember, a lifetime ago, getting that in-person, briefing on it. Is my memory correct in that we said at the end of the discussion that the implications of any decisions were going to be so large countywide that we were going to defer a T&E discussion and bring it directly to full council? Is that a correct recollection?
I don't think so.
No,
I don't think so. I think the next step in the process is for the committee to hear from interested parties, including haulers, residents, and I don't think it needs to go back to the council yet. Obviously, any significant recommendations that come out of that would, but I don't think we necessarily have to bring it back to the full council yet.
Okay.
Nor do I think our colleagues would want us to. I think the next step is to get through the budget and get through the pandemic, and then take up weighty topics like that one.
Right,
okay.
And that's the issue in terms of scheduling here, and
Right.
Just in terms of next steps, I think based on the discussions today, and I've noted in the packet some additional language that staff would suggest in the plan. I will work on that with DEP and circulate that among committee members to see if that addresses concerns committee members have. And then we can try to schedule this in a timely manner to get it out of committee, depending, of course, on budget and pandemic and everything else circulating around us.
Yep. All right. Well, wish we had more time for this, but thank you all. I know a lot of work went into it. Thank you all for your good work. We're counting on and grateful for even more in the future. Thank you so much. Stay in touch.
Thank you.